When that night began, I just wanted to go home without anyone noticing us. The fine rain pattered against my veil and clung to my tunic, and Sophia squeezed my hand so tightly, she seemed afraid even of the wind. I was 23 years old, wearing a simple habit, with a weary heart, and a 7-year-old sister who looked at the world as if it were still safe. The convent had taken me in when I had nothing, but now with the cuts, the debts, and the threats from the men who controlled the neighborhood, even God's house seemed too small to protect us. The orphanage I helped with in the afternoons was going to close. The children would be scattered throughout the city, and part of the money that supported the parish soup kitchen had simply vanished in security fees. On this side of town, everyone knew what security fee meant. I wasn't afraid of poverty. I'd always lived with little. What scared me was this constant feeling that someone could snatch Sophia from me in a second, on a dark street corner, in a hospital corridor with no one watching. When the owner of our tiny room warned that he was going to double the rent because of the situation, I understood that faith alone couldn't pay for a roof over my head. And that night, with the city wet, noisy, and hostile, I realized I was exhausted from trying to negotiate with the invisible while the visible tightened its grip. I held Sophia's hand tighter as we got off the crowded tram and headed towards the corner bakery cafe, the only place still open where I knew we could sit for a few minutes without someone rudely kicking us out. She skipped along despite the cold, as if this rainy walk was an adventure, not the trail of yet another day where I had to invent answers to questions I didn't want to hear. "Sister Anna, will the gentleman of the room let us stay?" she asked in a thin voice, raising her brown eyes to me. I lied softly, saying that God always found a way, even when the world seemed unable to, and she nodded as if that were enough. Inside the inner pocket of her tunic, the envelope with a few damp bills was all we had to pay for rent, food, and medicine for a few more days. I tried not to think about numbers, or overdue bills, or the sheet the parish lawyer left on the table talking about the approach of criminal groups in the region. I tried to focus only on getting to a place where Sophia could drink hot chocolate, even if it was the last luxury of the month. I pushed open the glass door of the bakery, and was swallowed by a strange, heavy silence, different from the usual end-of-day hubbub. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and bread coming out of the oven, normally welcoming, seemed today mixed with something I couldn't name, perhaps fear. The owner, who always smiled when he saw me enter in my habit with the child, didn't smile. He only inclined his head in a quick, nervous greeting, his eyes avoiding mine. I saw some customers adjusting their coats, getting up too quickly, bills left on the table without waiting for change. At the back of the room, a long table was occupied by men in dark suits, some with loosened ties, others with tattoos climbing up their necks and hands. They all spoke softly, but the entire atmosphere revolved around them, as if each breath awaited the permission of the most dangerous. I had seen those faces before, from afar, on the corners of the parish, inside dark cars parked where they shouldn't be, talking to people who owed more than they could pay. I turned my body almost instinctively to leave, but before I could reach the doorknob, a calm, deep voice, brimming with authority, cut through the air. The Mafia boss looked at the young nun and her sister. "You can sit down, but don't think you'll be leaving afterwards." It was just like that, dry and effortless, as if he were simply commenting on the weather, but I felt the sentence pierce my stomach. Sophia pressed against me from behind, holding the hem of my robe, and I clearly heard the sound of cutlery hitting the plate to the left, someone stopping chewing. I turned slowly, as if I could somehow deny that he was talking to me. His eyes were fixed on us, dark, attentive, assessing. He was a man in his early 30s, maybe older, impossible to say, his face marked by deep expression lines on his forehead, but the posture of someone accustomed to deciding the fate of others with few words. A discreet scar cut across his eyebrow, interrupting the perfect shape, as if it were a permanent reminder that he had already faced death up close. "Come," he repeated, pointing to the chair in front of him with a slight movement of his head, without raising his voice. Nobody laughed, nobody commented, nobody dared to say that it was strange. In that moment, I knew exactly who he was, even though nobody needed to pronounce his name. I approached the table, my heart racing, trying to keep my spine straight, and the serene expression I usually wore at funerals and hospital visits. Sophia came close beside me, her eyes wide, observing everything. The man cleared his throat, pushed a chair with his foot toward me, and another toward her, as if he were receiving honored guests and not two drenched intruders. I sat down slowly, my hands clasped in my lap, and felt the gaze of each of the other men rest on us for a second before returning to him, awaiting the script he would dictate. "I am Lorenzo de Luca," he said bluntly, as if reciting a fact as obvious as the color of the suit he wore. I had heard that surname so many times it sounded like a prayer in reverse on the streets of the neighborhood. "And you are the nun who spends her afternoons in the parish hall serving soup and smiling at children the government has forgotten," he added, tilting his head slightly, as if to show he knows more than he lets on. My throat went dry. "Yes, sir." "I am Sister Anna," I replied, trying to hide my surprise at discovering that the most feared man in the region knew not only where I worked, but also how I smiled. "And this one?" he asked, pointing with his chin at Sophia, who shrugged shyly. "My sister," I replied simply, because the story of how I raised her from infancy, after our mother died in a public hospital corridor without medicine, didn't fit in that moment. Lorenzo observed Sophia for a few long seconds, as if evaluating not only her facial features, but the possibilities of the future inscribed there. He discreetly snapped his fingers, and one of the men beside him stood up, going to the counter. "Hot chocolate for the girl and coffee for the sister," he ordered, as if he had already decided that we were entitled, at least that night, to a little warmth. "I see everything that happens in my territory, Sister Anna," he continued, twirling the empty cup between his fingers. "I know that the landlord of your room threatened to put you out on the street. I know that the parish is surrounded by debt. I know that there's a lawyer from the diocese trying to negotiate with people who don't understand the language of paper." Each piece of information was a blow, and at the same time, a strange relief, as if someone had finally voiced the weight I had been carrying alone. "And I know," he added, his gaze sharp, "that you continue walking through these alleys with that child by your side, as if habit were a bulletproof vest." "I don't have much of a choice, sir," I replied, feeling the hot cup being placed before me by the waiter's trembling hands. "I have what I have, and what I have is this." I was going to speak of faith, of divine providence, of miracles in small doses, but I fell silent. It seemed out of place to use those words before a man who carried death in his surname. Lorenzo leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, bringing his face close to mine as if he wanted to reduce the distance between two worlds that should never touch. "Do you think God ignores who I am, sister?" he asked, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think anything about you," I replied, too sincere to play diplomats at that moment. "I only know that your name is written on many papers that arrive at the parish with stories of broken families." For a second, the silence became even thicker, as if the air had swallowed the audacity of my sentence. One of the men beside him frowned, but Lorenzo raised his hand slightly, asking that no one interfere. "I like people who tell me the truth while looking me in the eye," he said finally. "It saves me time." He made an almost lazy gesture to the man who had gone to the counter, who was now returning with Sophia's chocolate and my coffee. "The man who's threatening to put you out on the street works for me," Lorenzo said, as if he were talking about the weather. "The parish debt papers also passed through my desk before reaching any judge's hands." I felt the coffee threaten to stick in my throat. It was as if, suddenly, I could see the invisible strings that pulled the world around us, all held in the fingers of the man in front of me. "If I snap my fingers, you'll wake up tomorrow with a year's rent paid, with no one knocking on the door at 3 a.m, he continued. "If I do nothing, you'll quickly discover how small this town is when someone decides you no longer have a place in it." He didn't speak loudly. He didn't threaten directly, but the choice was clearly drawn between one sentence and the next. Sophia brought her face closer to the chocolate, filling her lungs with the sweet steam, oblivious to the lines of war being drawn on our table. "And what would you gain by helping two strangers?" I asked, knowing there was no charity in businesses like his. Lorenzo took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair as if he had expected this very question. "I need someone in my house who isn't afraid to look at me and still talk about God," he said, with disconcerting simplicity. "My grandmother is ill, our family priest died, and nobody wants to enter through those gates without looking over their shoulder. You've already walked through worse alleys than my garden. Maybe you can handle it." The words hung in the air. I heard my house, my grandmother, my gates, and immediately pictured Sophia sleeping peacefully in a place with more than 2 chairs and a thin mattress. "I'm not a private chaplain," I replied, almost defensively. "I'm not for sale." He laughed, a low laugh, without mockery, but laden with something I couldn't decipher. "I don't buy faith, Sister Anna. I buy time, loyalty, presence, and in return, I give something that your habits can't guarantee out here: security. He then explained, in a few sentences, what he was really offering: a room for Sophia and me on the DeLuca family property, food, her education, a small salary officially sent to the parish so as not to arouse suspicion, and controlled visits to the convent. In exchange, I would have to accompany his grandmother, pray with her if she wished, listen to her troubles, be present at Sunday meals, to balance the table, as he put it, and occasionally intercede with the parish priest when a conflict needed a spiritual bridge. I knew what lay behind beautiful words like property, family, and balance in that context. I knew that, by accepting, I would be entering the heart of a structure I had learned to fear and avoid. But I also knew, looking at Sophia with the hot chocolate in her hands and flushed cheeks, that the options were running out. "You don't need to answer now," Lorenzo said, noticing the turmoil in my eyes. "But remember, the world out there has already decided what it's going to do with you. I'm just the only one who will put it on the table, honestly." I left the bakery with Sophia by the hand, the simple card he'd slipped me, with a handwritten phone number on the back, burning in my pocket. The rain had intensified, and the puddles reflected the yellow lights of the streetlights like tiny fragments of a weary sky. Sophia walked silently now, unlike her earlier animation, as if she had understood, in her childlike way, that something important had happened there. "Was he bad?" she asked suddenly, breaking the sound of the water falling on the sidewalks. I took a deep breath before answering, choosing each word as one chooses a path through a minefield. "He's dangerous," I finally said. "And dangerous people can do both good and evil, depending on what they want that day." She nodded slowly, thoughtfully, as if memorizing one of those phrases you don't fully understand, but know you'll carry with you for a long time. When we got to our room, the ceiling was dripping in 2 new spots. The wall had another mold stain, and the landlord's letter was tucked under the door, with a curt note warning that if I didn't pay by the end of the week, I would have to vacate the property. That morning, I prayed like I hadn't prayed in a long time. Not those mechanical prayers we repeat in chorus, but a raw, almost harsh conversation with a God who seemed to insist on working along lines I wouldn't dare to draw. I spoke of the obvious fears, of the name DeLuca and all the stories of violence in the neighborhood, of the feeling that I would enter a kind of gilded cage if I accepted. I also spoke of the exhaustion of seeing Sophia squeezed onto a damp mattress, of the shame of not being able to guarantee the minimum a child deserved, of the tightness in my chest every time I heard a car stop late at night on our street. I asked for a sign, even knowing that sometimes the only sign we receive is reality itself knocking at the door. When day broke, I was still awake, sitting on the floor beside Sophia's bed, watching her chest rise and fall in a tranquil rhythm that I felt I needed to protect at all costs. The old phone on the bedside table seemed to stare at me, silent, as if it knew that day, it would have to carry more than just ordinary calls. Late in the morning, before I could even conjure up an excuse for myself, I dialed the number scribbled on the card. On the other end, a polite, functional male voice introduced himself as Marco, the family driver, and said he was on his way to pick us up if we were still interested. There was no bargaining, no negotiation of additional conditions. Lorenzo's world, I realized, didn't operate on humble attempts, but on assertions. "We'll be ready," I replied, feeling the weight of the decision fall on my tongue, the instant the words left my mouth. I gathered our few belongings in silence: 2 small bags of clothes, a rosary, a worn wooden crucifix, a notebook with Sophia's drawings, and an old photo of our mother, folded in half. When the black car stopped in front of the building, some neighbors peeked out of their windows, others pulled their children inside, as if they had sensed an omen. Sophia gasped at the size of the vehicle, her eyes shining as the driver opened the back door for us, as if opening a gateway to another world. I took a deep breath, discreetly made the sign of the cross, and got in. The city began to change its face as we moved away from our neighborhood. The walls grew higher, the facades cleaner, the trees better cared for. The asphalt ceased to be patched and became a continuous smooth strip, as if no one would trip there. Sophia observed everything from the window, quietly narrating each puppy she saw, each square, each well-dressed child running with colorful backpacks. I alternated between the outside world and the world within me, where the voice of the parish priest echoed, saying in a recent sermon that There are houses that do not carry blessings but agreements with darkness. At the same time, another voice, more intimate, whispered that perhaps God was using crooked paths to offer me something I couldn't achieve through the straight way. When the gates of the DeLuca property appeared ahead, tall, wrought iron, flanked by discreet cameras and guards and almost invisible posts, I felt my stomach churn. The driver activated a remote control. The gates slowly opened, revealing an avenue lined with cypress trees, an impeccable garden, and, in the background, a house too big to fit into my neighborhood nun's head. We got out of the car in silence, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and expensive flowers I couldn't name. In front of the house, a marble staircase led up to a wide, dark wooden door that opened before we could even approach. A middle-aged woman, her hair pulled back in a perfect bun and wearing a discreet uniform, greeted us with a restrained but sincere smile. "Welcome, Sister Anna. This must be the little angel," she said, looking at Sophia with a tenderness I hadn't expected to find there. "I'm Clara, the housekeeper. Mr. Lorenzo asked me to show you around." I gave a brief nod, still trying to process the naturalness with which my name echoed through those corridors. We entered the main hall, and I felt an almost violent contrast. From the outside, the house commanded respect. Inside, it seemed like a mixture of museum and old home, full of family portraits on the walls, classic furniture, and a warm light emanating from well-placed lamps. Everything exuded wealth, yes, but also a kind of nostalgia, as if each piece there had witnessed too many stories. We were led down a side corridor, where a discreet elevator led to the second floor. Clara explained as we walked that the property had been built by Lorenzo's grandfather, an Italian who had arrived in the country with little more than a suitcase and unbridled ambition. He believed the house was the heart of the family, she said, almost confidentially, and, like every heart, it holds secrets. I chose not to ask what kind of secrets for now. We stopped before a white door at the end of the corridor. "This will be your room," he announced, opening it with a heavy key ring. The room was simple, considering the rest of the house, but still much more than Sophia and I were used to. 2 beds, a large wardrobe, a desk by the window overlooking the garden, a small crucifix on the wall, as if someone had foreseen that I would need that anchor there. Sophia ran to the window and began describing the flowers and fountains she saw below, while I set my bag down on the floor, still unsure whether to express my gratitude or be suspicious of the comfort. "Before lunch, Mr. Lorenzo would like you to meet his grandmother," Clara informed us, after giving us a few minutes to breathe. "She has good days and bad days. Today seems to be a good day." I felt a different kind of shiver in my stomach than the vague fear of the streets. It was the anxiety of entering the center of this new arrangement. We went down again, now by a narrower side staircase, which led us to a wing of the house where the silence was even denser. Clara knocked lightly on the half-open door and announced our arrival. "Grandma, Sister Anna has come," she said, with a mixture of respect and affection. The voice that answered from inside was firm, despite her age. "Come in." I entered with Sophia a step behind, and found a woman with completely white hair, tied in a low bun, sitting in an armchair near the window, with a woolen blanket over her legs. Her eyes, however, were the opposite of her frail body, lively, attentive, inquisitive. She sized us up before saying anything. "So, you're the nun my grandson wants to bring into this house like a new pair of curtains," she said bluntly, but with a hint of irony that made me suppress a smile. I introduced myself, quickly explained my work at the parish, my connection to the convent, and the fact that Sophia was my sister, and not an orphan from the institution. "Sister with a veil, but mother at heart," she murmured, more to herself than to me. She beckoned Sophia with a hand gesture, inviting her to come closer. My sister walked slowly, like a cautious little animal, until she was within reach of the wrinkled hand holding a cane. The old woman ran her fingers through Sophia's hair, brushed a strand away from her forehead, and examined her face with a seriousness that made me tense. "Well," she said finally, taking a deep breath, "God has a strange sense of humor." I saw something pass through her eyes at that moment, an old pain, a recognition, perhaps the memory of another child who once occupied that space. "My grandson thinks that bringing a nun into this house is a way of asking forgiveness for everything we've done," she continued, turning her gaze to me. "He's mistaken. Forgiveness isn't decoration, but sometimes God even uses a man's mistakes to save what can still be saved." I didn't know if she was talking about me, Sophia herself, or the whole family. We stayed there for a time I couldn't measure, talking about small things, The weather, the flowers in the garden, the children at the parish, and, from time to time, something bigger slipped through the words. She mentioned, without details, a granddaughter who left too soon, and a time when the house was full of children's laughter. I understood, without anyone needing to spell it out, that there was an empty place there, a space that Sophia occupied, even unintentionally, just by existing. When we said goodbye, my grandmother held my hand with surprising strength. "You know you've entered a house of war, don't you, sister?" she asked, looking deep into my eyes. "I know," I replied without hesitation, "but I also know that there are no places where God cannot enter." At lunchtime, the house seemed, for a few minutes, less like a fortress and more like a large family trying to reorganize itself. A long table occupied the center of the dining room, with place settings marked by small details that betrayed old habits. The grandmother's place, with a small bottle of medicine beside it. Lorenzo's place, with a bundle of folded papers within reach. Empty chairs whose owners I still didn't know. Sophia was placed next to her grandmother, who insisted on serving the girl's plate herself, as if rekindling a forgotten ritual. Lorenzo arrived a few minutes later, without fanfare, wearing a simple shirt, without a tie, which made him strangely more human. He greeted everyone with a brief nod, sat at the head of the table, and let the murmur of conversations fill the spaces between the cutlery. When our eyes met, he only made a slight gesture with his head, as if confirming an agreement already sealed. During the meal, I realized that beneath his commanding exterior, he was observing everything, every word exchanged, every gesture, every glance between the members of that household. After lunch, while Sophia ran around the garden with a ball that one of the employees had improvised for her, I found myself watching Lorenzo from afar, leaning on the balcony, talking on the phone. His tone of voice, which inside the bakery had been controlled and almost seductive, was now sharp, cold, full of codes I didn't understand, but whose weight I felt. I heard loose fragments: territory, rupture, Russians, old agreement. There's no room for weakness now. The words streaked through the air like dry sparks, reminding me that, however peaceful the garden seemed that afternoon, the ground beneath our feet was mined. When he hung up, he remained silent for a few seconds, watching Sophia run after the ball, laughing loudly, stumbling on the grass. There was something in the way he watched her, a mixture of tenderness, nostalgia, and fear, that made me understand that, for him, that child was more than a simple gesture of goodwill. She was a living reminder of something he had lost, and perhaps never truly managed to bury. That night, Clara showed us the small chapel in the house, a hidden room in the side corridor, with simple benches, a discreet altar, and worn candles. The old priest used to come here every day, she explained. Since he died, this place has been almost always empty. I entered with a strange feeling, as if I were stepping onto neutral territory within a country at war. I lit a candle, sat on the last bench, and let the silence envelop me. In the midst of all that opulence, in that house full of powers I barely understood, that small, humble space seemed paradoxically the most powerful. Sophia sat beside me, rested her head on my shoulder, and remained quiet, as if, intuitively, she also needed that respite. I didn't ask for answers that night. I only asked for clarity to recognize the dangers, courage to protect Sophia, and the grace not to lose who I was in the midst of that game whose rules I didn't yet know. Back in the room, after Sophia had fallen asleep exhausted, I approached the window and looked out at the garden illuminated by small lights scattered among the trees. Outside, the property looked like a postcard of calm, employees collecting dishes, 2 security guards walking predictable routes, the distant sound of a fountain. Inside, however, I could feel the tension vibrating in the walls, a subtle nervousness that wasn't new. It was then that I heard, coming from the hallway, the sound of muffled voices. I carefully opened the door, leaving only a crack, and realized that the voices were coming from the office at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar, and from where I was, I could only see a piece of the room, the reflection of a yellowish light, and the shadows of 2 men, Lorenzo and another, taller man, whom I didn't yet know well. The words came in fragments, but they were enough to draw an outline. "They tested our limits when they touched the parish," said the other voice. "If you bring that nun and that child inside and then back away, they'll think they can do whatever they want." Lorenzo responded with something about showing that the house still dictates the rules. protecting what is ours, and not repeating mistakes. I stood there, trying to decide whether to close the door and pretend I hadn't heard anything, or accept that, from that moment on, hearing things that weren't meant for me would be part of the package. When I finally went back inside, I closed the door slowly and rested my forehead against the cold wood. I had a clear feeling that I had just crossed an invisible border. I was no longer just the nun who came to lend a little faith to a troubled house. I was part of a narrative that had been written for years, with blood, money, and irrevocable decisions. I lay down next to Sophia, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and spent some time observing my sister's tranquil face, trying to memorize that peace, like someone who knows that sooner or later it will be put to the test. Outside, somewhere in the city, men whose names I didn't yet know were talking about territories, revenge, and alliances, unaware that inside a house surrounded by high walls, a 23-year-old nun was silently trying to negotiate the price of remaining on that chessboard without losing her own soul. The following morning began with a soft light streaming through the window, a golden glow that transformed the simple room into something almost sacred. Sophia woke before me, as always, and sat on the edge of the bed, silently watching the garden leaves sway in the light breeze. "Sister Anna, it seems the world is less noisy here," she murmured, with that simplicity that sometimes captured profound truths. I got up slowly, trying to organize my thoughts, before the day swallowed me whole. I put on my robe, adjusted my veil, and said a quick prayer, asking for serenity. Sophia played with her rosary between her fingers, repeating softly, "Lead us, not into temptation." The irony of the phrase burned my mouth, because at that moment, I wasn't sure what the temptations were: comfort, security, or the illusion of believing that power and goodness could coexist without cost. When we went down for breakfast, I found a table laden with fresh fruit, warm bread, and aromatic teas, the kind I'd only seen at parish donor dinners. Clara appeared with a tray, and that way of hers of observing everything without letting anything show. "Mr. Lorenzo asked you to meet him after coffee," she said, placing a jug of milk on the table. "He has something to discuss regarding routine adjustments." Her expression suggested that routine adjustments was merely a polite label for something deeper. Sophia helped herself excitedly, delighted with the homemade yogurt and orange cake. Sometimes, the contrast between her carefree childhood and the weight of the world around her tore me apart. While I drank my tea, I heard in the distance a noise of quick, tense male voices, an echo of the previous night. Clara noticed my gaze. "You'll need to get used to this. This isn't an ordinary home," she commented with a sincerity that, curiously, reassured me more than any attempt to normalize the atmosphere. I took a deep breath and nodded in thanks. The truth is, I still didn't know if I was trying to adapt to a new house or a new destiny. When I finished setting the table and taking Sophia's hand to lead her to the garden, Lorenzo appeared in the refectory doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit. He had on a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing tattoos that subtly climbed his skin. It was almost unsettling to see him like that, without the veneer of formality, as if that version of him was the truest, and perhaps the most dangerous. "I need to talk to you," he said, without asking if I had time. He glanced quickly at Sophia, as if calculating her distance, her safety, her vulnerability. "You can leave her with Clara for a few minutes." Sophia ran to the housekeeper without hesitation, and that gave me a strange pang. She was beginning to trust that place too much. Lorenzo and I walked down a side corridor that led to an inner courtyard. The sun shone on the water of a small fountain, creating reflections that made the scene almost too beautiful for the tension emanating from the man beside me. "There are things you need to understand before you continue here," he began, resting his hands on the marble railing. "Yesterday, when you arrived, it wasn't just a nun entering my house. It was a sign." He spoke, looking at the water, as if its movement helped organize his thoughts. "The Russians have been testing my limits, and bringing you and the child inside could be interpreted as weakness or as a provocation. I haven't yet decided which strategy will be most useful." My heart raced at that brutal frankness. "Mr. Lorenzo, I didn't come here to be used as a pawn," I said, maintaining a firm tone, even though inside I was fighting not to tremble. He turned his face to me, and for a moment his usual hardness gave way. "I know," he replied, with an almost gentle sincerity, "but in this house, no one can completely escape the chessboard." He rubbed his forehead with his palm, tired. "The question is, are you willing to walk that chessboard if it means protecting your sister?" Yes, I answered more quickly than I expected, because the answer had been inside me since the previous night. He nodded, as if he already knew. Then I need you to understand that the next few weeks are going to be tense. There are movements you don't see. There are conversations you can't hear. There are risks you can't even imagine. His frankness scared me, but paradoxically it gave me a strange kind of confidence. I prefer the hard truth to the silence that hides knives. Do you think you should tell me all this? Why? I asked. He took a deep breath. Because someone already died because of me without knowing where they were stepping. I'm not going to repeat that. The unspoken name hung between us. The lost granddaughter. The child who had left a mark on her grandmother. In the hallways. In his heart. It was impossible not to connect the dots. Perhaps I was there occupying a space that still hurt. Before I could answer, one of the men from the house appeared in the courtyard, urgently calling Lorenzo. He cast one last glance at me, a mixture of command, warning, and something indefinable, and left. I stood there for a few moments, absorbing the suffocating sensation of being at the center of forces I didn't control. When I returned to the garden, I found Sophia playing ball with Clara and 2 employees, who seemed as enchanted by her joy as they were frightened by their own spontaneity. Sophia ran to me, laughing, and grabbed my arm. Sister Anna, you need to see the size of the butterflies here. I smiled, even with the weight of the previous moment still vibrating within me. That's how life insists on surviving, in the laughter of a child unaware of the wars around her. I walked with her through the garden, and for a few minutes I forgot about mobsters, threats, and invisible agreements. I simply observed in silence how the light filtered through the flowers. Later, Clara led me back to Lorenzo's grandmother's room. The door was ajar, and I heard the old woman cough softly. I entered carefully, announcing my presence. Sit down, she said, patting the armchair beside hers. I obeyed, placing my rosary on my lap. What did you think of the first day? She asked bluntly. I never know for sure if she's testing me or preparing me. Intense, I replied, but perhaps necessary. She laughed, a dry laugh, full of ancient wisdom. Nothing that happens in this house is by chance, sister. Neither what seems like a blessing, nor what seems like a misfortune. She ran her fingers along the arm of the chair. My grandson is trying to keep upright an empire that was born crooked, and sometimes to correct a branch, you need to uproot it. The metaphor made me swallow hard. Are you afraid for him? I asked. She sighed. I fear for all who enter and leave these gates. Here, even love hurts. We talked for almost an hour. About faith, about pain, about families that support themselves as best they can, about ancestral guilts passed down from generation to generation. At several points, I realized she was studying me, as if trying to figure out if I was strong enough to stay, or weak enough to be broken. When I got up to leave, she grabbed my wrist. Protect that girl. Sometimes God puts certain children in our path to remind us that there is still light in the world. The problem is that light, she paused for a long time, always attracts shadows. I left the room with that phrase burning in my chest. In the hallway, Lorenzo waited, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. I shuddered, surprised that I hadn't heard his footsteps. Did my grandmother approve of you? He asked with a half smile. I don't know yet, I replied. He shrugged. She knows. That same afternoon, Lorenzo asked me to accompany him to his office. The room was spacious, with shelves full of books and a huge desk where papers, folders, and maps were scattered like pieces of a puzzle only he knew how to assemble. He indicated the chair in front of me and sat down. I need to be completely transparent with you, he began. The neighborhood where you lived is about to become a dispute. The police won't intervene. The Russians are pressuring you, and any connection you have with the parish now could put people at risk. The information hit me like a direct blow. Then it's worse than I imagined, I murmured. He nodded. Much worse. And that's why you're here. I needed to get you out of there before someone else realized that you, he searched for the words, have value to me. The sentence hung in the air, ambiguous, heavy, dangerous. I hesitated before asking, value? How? He raised his eyes and held mine without looking away. You think it's just because you're a nun? No. It's because, from the moment you walked into that bakery, you haven't shrunk back. You haven't lowered your eyes. You haven't apologized for existing. That, Sister Anna, is rare. The compliment, coming from him, seemed more like a warning than an embellishment. But that also makes you a target. I swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise up my neck. I didn't ask to be a target for anything, I replied. He shook his head slowly. I know, but you entered my world. And here, even those who breathe become part of the war. He clasped his hands on the table. So, if you want to leave, it's now, before staying becomes irreversible. I wanted to answer immediately, but the words wouldn't come out. I thought of Sophia running in the garden, laughing like I hadn't seen her laugh in months. I thought of the damp room that awaited us if we returned. I thought of the landlord's letter demanding immediate payment. I thought of the parish surrounded by debt. I thought of all the small, silent deaths I had been facing in recent years. Staying is dangerous, I finally said. And leaving is worse, he added, before I could finish the sentence. There was truth in what he said, a truth I didn't want to admit, but which was there, evident. Then I'll stay, I declared, knowing that this choice was a line I could no longer unravel. He gave a slight nod, as if receiving a confirmation he already expected. From now on, you will always be accompanied on the property. And, Anna, he paused, choosing the word carefully, don't trust anyone who doesn't have my name. The sentence carried more layers than I could decipher at that moment. When we left the office, the afternoon was already turning orange. Sophia came running down the hallway, carrying with her the scent of grass and sunshine. Sister Anna, you have to see this. Mr. Lorenzo's grandmother showed me a flower that only blooms when the sun goes down. She spoke excitedly, unaware that I had just entrusted her future to a world I barely understood. Lorenzo crouched down to her level. Did you like the garden? He asked. Sophia nodded, holding the hem of my robe. It seems happy here. He smiled so discreetly that perhaps only I noticed. Then let's do our best to keep it that way. After he walked away, Sophia pulled me back into the garden. Want to play with me? I did. God knows I wanted that piece of normalcy, but something in my chest insisted on reminding me that, at that very moment, invisible forces were moving outside, and that some of them were approaching us. As night fell, the house seemed to change its mood. The lights came on slowly, one by one, as if each room were waking up for a different shift. Guards positioned themselves in strategic places. Employees spoke more quietly. Doors closed carefully. It was as if the property had two versions, the daytime one, which tried to imitate a home, and the nighttime one, which accepted being the fortress it truly was. I put Sophia to bed with the same ritual as always. Prayer, a kiss on the forehead, covered up to her chin. When I closed the bedroom door, I found Clara in the hallway, holding a tray of tea. It's for you, she said. It will help you sleep. I thanked her, but as soon as she walked away, I realized my hands were still trembling from the meeting in the office. I sat in the armchair, taking small sips of tea, trying to organize all the facts, risks, and choices that were piling up like stones inside me. The truth is, even with all the fear, I felt that, for the first time in years, someone was saying, "You won't face this alone." But the quiet was short-lived. Near midnight, a sharp crack echoed from the back of the property. I jumped up with a start, rushing to the window. Outside, 2 security guards were running toward the side wall. A light came on in the garden, then another, followed by low, rapid voices. My heart raced. I opened the bedroom door, making sure Sophia was still fast asleep, and went down a few steps just to get a better look. From the hallway outside the living room, I could see Lorenzo talking to 3 men, his voice low, his face closed, the posture of someone about to go into battle. He seemed different, not the man from the bakery, nor the host at the dinner table, nor the attentive grandson. He was the commander, the strategist, the necessary predator, the one who kept others alive by getting himself dirty. Marco, the driver, saw my look and quickly approached. "Go back to the room, sister," he whispered. Now, the tone wasn't threatening, but urgent. I obeyed, but not before feeling something very clear pierce my chest. The war was closer than I thought. Inside the room, I closed the door slowly and rested my forehead against the wood. The heavy silence of the early morning seemed to mock my faith, pulling it into a dark corner where answers wouldn't reach me. I sat on the floor, near Sophia's bed, watching her face in the dim light of the lamp. Her childhood world remained untouched, and by God, I wanted to keep it that way. But in the distance, I heard car engines starting, doors slamming, hurried footsteps. It was impossible not to feel that this night marked the beginning of something bigger, something I couldn't yet name. I squeezed the crucifix between my fingers, unable to formulate a complete prayer, Fear does that to us. It tears words apart before they become prayer. When I finally forced myself to lie down, my body was exhausted, but my mind remained awake, repeating a single phrase, like a warning, like an omen. You entered a house at war. And for the first time, I understood that the war wasn't just theirs. It was ours too. My last memories of that early morning were of a distant sound, perhaps a gate opening, perhaps footsteps receding, and the feeling, so vivid that even today I can't explain it, that someone outside had just crossed a line of no return. I closed my eyes, still unaware, but feeling in my soul that the real storm wouldn't be the one outside, but the one about to form within the walls of the DeLuca house, and that somehow I would be a part of it, whether I was prepared or not. The following morning, the house seemed thick with silence. Lorenzo only returned at dawn, his shoulders tense and his gaze carrying something he was trying to hide, not fear, but calculation. Before I could ask, he called me for a walk in the garden. He explained that the Russians had definitively broken the old agreement. They had advanced into new territories, tested the security, and made it clear they wouldn't back down. Your and Sophia's presence here accelerated decisions, he said bluntly. It didn't sound like guilt, but like someone who had finally stopped running from his own shadow. From today on, full reinforcement. The house is on high alert. At that moment, I realized that my life had ceased to be divided between inside and outside the Mafia. Now everything was a single chessboard, and I was at the center. Still, something in the way he spoke, direct, without manipulation, gave the feeling that, for the first time, he was planning not only for his family, but also for mine. A few hours later, Lorenzo's grandmother asked to see me. I entered the room and found her weaker, but with eyes still sharp as blades. My grandson came back different today, she murmured. He finally understood what he needs to protect. Before I could answer, she held my hand with surprising firmness. And you, Sister Anna, you didn't come here by chance. When God wants to change a house, he doesn't send soldiers. He sends someone who knows how to love. She looked at Sophia, who was drawing in the corner of the room, and, with moist eyes, added, "The light of a child disturbs the darkness, but it also defeats it." It was at that moment that I understood. I wasn't just a visitor, and Sophia wasn't just a child enchanted by the garden. We had both entered there as survivors, and now we were part of the healing of a house that carried more ghosts than living people. That night, Lorenzo called me into his office. Maps were scattered, phones vibrated, men came and went, but he seemed to be on another wavelength, firm, decisive, almost serene. I fired half the commanders who were sabotaging old agreements. I instituted new rules. I reduced violent operations. And if the Russians want war, they'll face not just weapons, but strategy. He looked me in the eyes with a sincerity no one had ever offered me. When you walked into that bakery, I thought it was weakness to let you and the girl get close. Today I understand it was the first right decision in a long time. The confession had no charm or seduction. It was a raw truth, and that's why it hurt so deeply. Finally he added, "I want you to stay, not as a pawn, not as a forced choice, as part of what I want to rebuild here." It was the maximum vulnerability a man like him could offer, and paradoxically, it was also the most honest. That same night, while the house slept, the tension finally subsided. The guards' warnings faded, the radios fell silent, and the garden seemed to breathe again. I found Lorenzo sitting on the porch, staring into the darkness, as if gazing at a future he couldn't yet name. I sat beside him, speechless. He said nothing for a few minutes, until finally murmuring, "If I can transform this house, maybe I can transform myself." It wasn't a promise. It was a plea for faith, not religious, but human. "And you?" he asked softly. "Why do you stay?" I looked at the house, at the room where Sophia slept peacefully, at the crucifix I held when fear gripped me, and replied, "Because sometimes God puts us in the eye of the storm not to escape it, but to help someone get through it." He smiled almost imperceptibly, like someone finding peace for the first time in years. Dawn found the house different, no less dangerous, no less complex, but more alive. Sophia ran through the garden with her grandmother giggling softly at the sight of her, while the staff seemed less tense, as if the weather had changed seasons. Lorenzo walked towards us, not as the Mafia boss everyone feared, but as a man who finally understood why he fought. "From today on," he said, "this house will no longer be remembered for the blood it spilled, but for what it can still save." And in that instant, As the sun streamed through the trees and illuminated Sophia's face, I realized that we hadn't been swallowed up by that world. We had in fact rewritten part of it. The war continued outside, yes, but inside that house, something had changed forever. There was a home being rebuilt, there was hope gaining ground, and there was a dangerous man learning for the first time what it meant to protect not for power, but for love. If this story moved you, if at any point your chest tightened, your breath caught, or you found yourself rooting for people living on the edge of the abyss, then you're already part of this world. Here on this channel, each video takes you closer to the boundaries between love, danger, loyalty, and survival. Stories that don't romanticize war, but show what it does to those who try to survive. If you've made it this far, subscribe now. Don't put it off. The algorithm doesn't forgive procrastinators, and you know you'll want to keep following these stories that tear you apart inside. Here, the narrative isn't light. It's not pretty, but it's real. It's human. It's what happens when fragile lives come into contact with dangerous men, and every choice can cost a piece of the future. Comment below. Which scene surprised you? Who captivated you more? His power or her courage? What do you think will happen next? I read everything, and often the next scripts are born from the comments. And take the opportunity to tell me, what kind of story would you like to see in the next video? The world of the Mafia, cartels, dangerous bosses, unlikely romances, broken alliances. You choose the terrain. I'll dig the plot. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who also enjoys intense narratives full of tension, mystery, and plot twists. Here at Shadow Hearts, we don't deliver fantasy. We deliver adrenaline, raw emotion, and characters who bleed, love, and survive. I'll see you in the next video. And remember, in the worlds we describe here, those who don't choose a side become victims of someone else's story.